and get started today. So good afternoon, everybody, and a big welcome to another one of our audio webinar sessions. We've been running webinars for the last 4 years, covering topics around supply chain due diligence and governance issues. Welcome to those who are still joining. Just a few housekeeping points for today. We are going to have a question and answer session. So please do use the question and answer chat session, which is at the bottom of your screen. We will attempt to address all your questions and answers in this particular, in the time scale. The session is being recorded and a link will be available on our website if you'd like to listen to this afterwards. And so for those of you who are new to audio, new to our webinars, welcome, as I've said before. My name is Colleen Turon. I'm a tri-qualified lawyer and the founder of Audio International. And I'm joined today actually by Hannah Dale, who is one of our consultants and who's going to be speaking as well. As a business, for those of you who haven't worked with us, we are a specialist sustainability business and human rights consultancy with expertise in modern slavery and forced labor. We work internationally, we work across sectors, and we've been in existence for over 15 years. Actually, I normally have a slide of who are some of the companies that we work with, but I see we haven't added that today. I think we concentrated on the fact that we also trying to share that we do share that we are, as a business, attempt to be, we are personable, practical and principled. And I'm very excited today to be joined by Dr. Robert Kovas. I hope I've got I hope I've said it right, Robert, and Dr. Amy Benstead. Robert is a senior, Robert is special counsel at Withersworth Worldwide, and Amy is a senior lecturer in fashion management at the University of Manchester. And I'm going to let both of them introduce themselves more fully when they are talking. Just very briefly from our end, we just wanted to share and position this a little bit for the audience before bringing Robert and Amy into this conversation. I think for many of you who are listening today, you are aware of how much the landscape around managing business responsibly has changed. And I think for those of you who've probably been on some of our previous webinars, you've probably heard me say this more than once, that, you know, we really see significant changes around the growth in legislation around responsible business practices, the fact that, you know, many organizations, particularly global entities, are having to consider how they manage their reputation better, how they manage their risk in a more informed way and in a way that they can demonstrate they have effective procedures. And that, of course, filters into how they manage both their organizational risk and their supply chain management. And then, of course, we're also living in very uncertain global times where we're seeing business costs being squeezed. We've seen the impact to people, particularly a fallout of the pandemic, which we know is still critical in many parts of the world, the war in Ukraine. And alongside this, the increase by investors and banks and the financial sector in ensuring that those people who get the benefit of their investments and money are actually able to demonstrate responsible business practices. Now, really, in this context of responsible business, those of you listening will no doubt be aware of the key frameworks and guidelines that have set standards for responsible business practices over the last 13 years. And the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights is seen as a game changer, seen as the standard for both business and actually governments on how to address human rights issues in business. And the OECD due diligence guidelines for responsible business conduct also sets out requirements for businesses to be able to demonstrate that they act responsibly. The OECD guidelines have been updated this year in response to the urgent social, environmental, and technological priorities facing society and business. And they are worth a read. I think we've summarized some of our key takeaways on a blog on our website if you want to just skim over that. But I think what we have to bear in mind is that whilst these are voluntary frameworks and, you know, known as soft law, we have seen a marked change in how they are being adopted. And when you look at the landscape change in legislation in the last 10 years, we see this growth in due diligence legislation, and we see that the legislation that is being enacted, coming to the fore, is drawing on the UNGPs, the OECD guidelines, as critical aspects of demonstrating how you meet the compliance requirements of the laws. And so there's this shift in thinking that it is no longer soft law, that it is actually being drafted into hard law and into contracts. And I know Robert is going to talk about that as well in his presentation. And I think that what doesn't show on here is that actually the proposed EU due diligence directive, known as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, has now been given the green light. There are particular aspects of it that still have to be clarified, but it is a certainty that it will come into force in some shape or form in the next 2 years. It will have to be transposed into member states. And I think when you consider that, it's also worth considering what are all the other rafts of laws around sustainability and reporting that will link into this directive. And I think why that's particularly useful for the garment industry, as it would be for many other sectors as well, is having to start thinking across their environmental and their social practices, and having to think around how these particular issues are interlinked, and if you're a business, how you are going to address those in a way that is not just a silo managed practice in a business. And I would say one thing that, you know, we notice is that for many businesses, the thought that something is only coming into force in maybe a year or 2 years time might think, well, actually, we don't have to deal with that now. Because of the requirements of these laws, the 2 years that you have now is absolutely what's going to be needed to get your journey started and to get everything in place to be able to demonstrate compliance, because it is so cross-functional. It requires data, it requires information, it requires governance, and it requires, you know, people within the business, not just your sustainability manager, your ethical manager, everyone to be building into this. And I'm sure that as you listen to Robert and also to Amy, that, you know, there will be perhaps some more insights as to why it is really important that companies that haven't started thinking about how they are more transparent, accountable, and disclose appropriately that around due diligence processes, that they really start getting that into place. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to ask Hannah to please come in and just to talk to us a little bit around a case that has hit the headlines that's possibly really pertinent to the garment sector, and also in respect of the roundtable. So I should just say that Amy, Robert, and myself and Hannah hosted a roundtable a month ago, where we invited a number of businesses from the garment industry to come and share their own challenges and barriers that they are facing around supply chain due diligence. And Hannah's going to share a few of those takeaways. So Hannah, if I can hand over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll go into a bit more detail on the roundtable on the next slide, just to cover the case that's up on the screen at the moment. At the end of last year, the lawsuit against Tesco made headlines, and it's a lawsuit against both Tesco and their social auditors, Intertek. And a letter before action detailing allegations has been sent on behalf of 130 migrant workers and 1 migrant child by law firm Leday. And the lawsuit claims that workers were trapped in a cycle of forced labour and debt bondage, with allegations that they were paid as little as £4 a day, And there was also some context in the lawsuit around the unsanitary and dangerous working conditions that workers were both working and living in at those factories. Just an update on the case. There has been no progress as of yet, and Libe has asked Tesco and Intertek to settle the workers' claims. If this does not happen, then they will consider progressing the matter to the High Court. And if it does get progressed, it will be the first lawsuit of this kind in the UK to go to court, as Tesco had no day-to-day involvement in the factory, and it's not a factory that they directly own. If we just go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So as Colleen spoke to, we hosted a invitation-only roundtable last month for businesses operating in the garment industry, and it looked at the same topic that we're focused on for this webinar today. So it was around common challenges and solutions in building a responsible supply chain. We had 12 participants attend from across 10 brands, and they were a real mix of brands from high street names to luxury high-end fashion. And I think this mix of brands gave us a real variety of discussion, and we were able to look across very different business models, but we were also able to identify some common challenges that is faced by the garment industry. And those are just up on the screen there. So visibility was pulled out as probably the biggest challenge that brands are currently facing, and traceability of their supply chains. And this was more noticeable the further you go down, with challenges obtaining information. The reliability of data was also pulled out, difficulties in effectively communicating efforts. And as part of this discussion, we focused on greenwashing and greenhushing concerns, and how sometimes being able to effectively communicate efforts is difficult when you use certain language, and how you can communicate to both customers and other internal team members without using this technical jargon. Inconsistencies in regulation, uncertainty of benchmarks, and queries where responsibility for human rights due diligence best sits were also brought up as part of that discussion. You could just go to the next slide. So after discussing the challenges that we face, we also spent some time in the roundtable going through successful solutions and also establishing what's needed in this space to make progress. And the biggest thing that was pulled out was a lack of collaboration. And there was a report published earlier this year by Planet Tracker that pulled out the need for collaboration in this space, which matches our findings from the roundtable. In the report, Planet Tracker identified that retailers need to take more active roles in ensuring transparency throughout their supply chain. And I think there is a definite need for collaboration in this space, because a lot of people use the same suppliers and are duplicating efforts at this current time. And if we are just able to streamline those efforts, there will definitely be an improvement in transparency. That's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. And so I think if I can just please hand over to Amy Benstead, and of course I hope you're busy noting down your questions to raise with us after this. So Amy, if I can hand over to you, thank you.
Great, thank you, Colleen. Hi everyone, so I'm really pleased to be here today. So I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester, and my background is actually in industry. So I was most recently a senior merchandise manager working for Li & Fung. I was based out in Istanbul in Turkey for a few years. So I've worked with most of the major high street fast fashion retailers, and was involved in kind of the sourcing and managing production. And then I've returned to academia. I did my PhD when the modern slavery legislation was introduced in the UK. And now my research focuses very much on kind of social sustainability, transparency, modern slavery, and also some blockchain as well. And I'm also quite keen on like local production as well, and looking at reshoring and creating kind of sustainable production in the UK. So I thought I'd just run through some of my research today, building on what Colleen and Hannah have said. You know, as we've touched on, transparency really is kind of the heart of legislation, and it's only really through transparency are we going to really understand kind of what's going on within the supply chain, increase awareness of risks, and this is how we're really going to drive change. And that's what we really need. We really need industry change and companies coming together. So I'll also touch on collaboration on some of my next few slides. There is obviously some nervousness as well, because when we think about transparency, there is obviously costs, particularly in terms of like supply chain mapping and really trying to understand your supply chain. It is resource intensive. And there's also nervousness, particularly when it comes to disclosure risks as well. So I'll touch on some of those as we go through. Next slide, please, Queen.
Sorry, what's happening with my slides? There we go. Sorry, Steve.
Great, thank you, no problem. So quite a lot of my research has looked at auditing. There's quite a lot of criticism when it comes to auditing. I don't think it's necessarily going to go away, but there's lots of issues surrounding like mock compliance, for example, and audit fatigue. As Hannah touched on, so many different brands and retailers use the same factories, but suppliers are under so much pressure to constantly be audited by different companies. So it's just like audit overload, and they're getting really tired of this as well. That can also lead to kind of mock compliance as well, and almost kind of cheating to try and pass the audits. We're seeing kind of auditing moving from a more compliance approach to a developmental approach, which is definitely needed. Moving from this very top-down tick box approach to due diligence to a more developmental approach, where companies need to work with suppliers. They need to understand kind of what works for them and what doesn't work for them, and that link to purchasing practices as well. And then when we think about modern slavery, it really expands the scope of kind of a one-size-fits-all audit, because that's what we see at the moment with audits. They are very focused on kind of what's happening within the four walls of a factory. And when we start to think about modern slavery, we need to understand kind of, how are those workers getting into the factory, for example, were they trafficked? And understanding more about their lifestyle as well. Do they actually have access to funds? Do they have access to their bank books, their passports, for example? So it is getting a lot more complex. So I did some research on a targeted audit. We actually went to Southeast Asia with a company and did a real deep dive to understand what was happening within the factory and indicators of modern slavery. But it was very resource intensive. We were there for a week. We collaborated with another brand, so we had that kind of leverage with the factory as well. The real issue, like I said, was it was resource intensive, and you couldn't replicate this across your supply chain because companies work with so many different factories. But we did suggest that everyone should do a deep dive, at least in one of the factories in their supply chain, so that you can really understand what is actually going on. And that can really then help with kind of understanding policy and processes and making those necessary changes. Next slide, please, Colleen. Thank you. So yeah, Hannah touched on collaboration. This is another part of my research that I looked at in quite a lot of detail. And collaboration is so important, particularly when there is uncertainty. And when we saw from Kalinia, there's so many different legislation's been introduced at the moment, and I looked at this in particular when the UK modern slavery was introduced, and there was a lot of uncertainty in terms of kind of what do we look at, what do we actually report, kind of will there be any backlash when we start publicising kind of what we found and so on. So it's really important that companies do come together in this instance, and also to share expertise, and also to help out with cost as well, because there is so much overlap within the supply chain. We also found that, and it might sound really obvious, but how important it is to have a similar mindset with those that you collaborate with as well, and also having to decouple the commercial and sustainability agenda. So we saw how important and how it was happening that competitors were actually collaborating with one another. And to actually have the change that we need, we do need competitors to come together. But we did see that they were actually doing this and actually separating their commercial and sustainability agenda. And this is really facilitated by NGOs as well. And that really helped kind of bridge the gap, have that kind of impartial element, and help nurture those relationships as well. because the research also showed the importance of trust and also how important prior relationship history was. And that really helped with project success. And even like coming to events like today, being with like-minded people, like-minded companies, we could see how beneficial this was. Also, companies that work with different NGOs or trade bodies and get involved in lots of different projects that might not necessarily be totally focused on human rights or modern slavery, but we saw that different projects that were happening really helped build trust. And then maybe a few years later, they really focused on something to do with modern slavery or human rights. And it was just so important to actually involve the third party, NGOs, trade bodies as well, because they can really share resources and expertise and help bring different companies together. Next slide, please. Thank you. I thought I'd just finally touch on some of the research I've done with the University of Liverpool, where we were looking at incentivising effective transparency and really trying to understand transparency and disclosure and some of the disincentivized, or how companies are disincentivized. So when we're thinking about discovering what's happening with the supply chain, it is very costly. And then when it comes to actually disclosing what's happening in your supply chain, there is often kind of risk-based concern as well. So the goal is in the top corner where the star is, effective transparency. And this is where firms are really informed about what's happening in their supply chain and really engage in terms of publicly disclosing this information and sharing with the public, what is actually happening. The opposite being uninformed and disengaged, so companies that do not know what's happening in their supply chain and really disengage when it comes to actually disclosing what's going on, because they don't actually know. And then we were looking at kind of how do you move from this uninformed and disengaged to informed and engaged. And actually it's not a straight line, because what we found was there were two different routes and varying in between as well, but you could either have kind of risk aversion or change embracing routes. So we found that some companies are actually really informed about what's happening in their supply chain, but are quite disengaged when it comes to disclosure. They're quite nervous and they don't want to disclose. So companies like Nike went through this kind of risk aversion route where they did actually start to understand what was happening with their supply chain. It took some time before they actually had that confidence to disclose, and then they've actually benefited from actually doing this. The opposite being change embracing route, where companies can actually be uninformed, but they're really engaged and they are actually being transparent in terms of disclosing kind of the unknowns. And this is really interesting in our research, how important it is to actually disclose unknowns and actually just show the limitations of what's happening in your supply chain and show what you found and what you need to actually start investigating and what some of the issues are. Obviously it does open you up to some scrutiny if you've said that you found an issue or you've got an issue that you don't know what to do with yet, but then you've got that time to start discovering, and then you will actually incur those discovery costs. But we thought that was really encouraging, that you should actually acknowledge the limitations in your supply chain and don't wait until you're fully informed before you disclose, but start to disclose, all the way along kind of your journey to transparency. Yeah, and that's me. I will hand over to Robert now.
Thank you so much, Amy. That's so interesting. And I particularly like how you've ended on the discovery disclosure piece, because I think, Robert, you may want to touch on this in the question answer session, the nervousness that is experienced by organizations and kind of where's that fine line between actually offering information that provides the readers, I guess your stakeholders, with a sense of where you are, but at the same time being slightly conscious of the fact that the risk is, if you don't know what's there, or if you can't disclose appropriate processes, where that liability might lie. So I will stop and hand over to Robert. I'm looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you. No, that's a very interesting piece as well. And what do you have to disclose by regulatory requirements, and what would you voluntarily disclose as well? So we can discuss that in the question and answers. But thank you very much for organising today, Colleen and Hannah as well, and Amy. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Robert Kovacs. I'm Special Counsel at the international law firm of Withers. I'm in the International Arbitration and Public International Law team. I've been advising companies in the area of business and human rights for the past 9 years across a range of sectors, including fashion, hospitality, sport, mining, renewables, and finance. And I've also represented companies in litigation and arbitration in this area, as well as in sustainability more generally. So today what I wanted to do, and we can move on to the, actually no, this is a good slide, the brief overview of some of the regulatory and other risks that exist within the supply chain, particularly in relation to the garment sector, but also more generally. I'm going to divide this presentation into 4 parts. And first, I'm going to address the regulatory risks, particularly within the EU and the UK. Then a brief overview of litigation risks. Then I'm going to address contractual as well as governance issues, and then briefly touch upon reputational risks to conclude. If we could move to the next slide, please. So first, in relation to the regulatory risk sides, and as Colleen mentioned, at the international level, there's 2 key documents which are informing the approach that businesses as well as governments should take to deal with issues of human rights within the supply chains, which are the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as the OECD guidelines now for responsible business conduct. There, as Colleen mentioned, soft law principles and guidance, but they're often now used as inspiration for more concrete legislative regimes that have been implemented in particular countries and that are going to be in the future, as well as guidance for businesses when they're establishing their own policies and practices within their organization. So these are the sort of international standards that are looked towards. I'm going to focus on the EU and the UK, given our it's sort of the most closely connected to this region. But depending on which country you're going to be operating in, your business operates in, which is often very international and interconnected, particularly with different supply chains, you're going to need to consider the relevant requirements in those particular countries as well. But let me move on to, if you can move on to the next slide, please, the EU. There's been a number of initiatives at the EU level in this area, as well as initiatives that are going to come down in the pipeline in the next year or 2 or 5 that are being planned at the EU level. First, there's the EU Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and this requires reporting on a broad range of sustainability issues, including environment, social and human rights impacts. The first phase of this is going to apply in 2024, and then it'll apply to a number of companies over the next few years. It'll broaden its reach, but this will apply to companies within the garment sector. The second aspect is the European Commission's proposal, which will take place, but it just depends in what form, on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. And so this will introduce a duty of due diligence for sustainability issues, starting off large EU companies and also companies operating in high-risk sectors. So that can include the manufacture of textiles, but it will also apply to non-EU companies that have significant activity within the EU. Once the directive is implemented, companies most likely will have to identify, prevent, mitigate and stop adverse human rights impacts within their operations, but as well as subsidiaries and those in their value chains. Member states are also likely under this regime to impose fines for non-compliance and also potentially provide victims of human rights impacts with an ability to bring civil liability claims against companies before their local national courts. If we can move on to the next slide, please. The European Commission has also have a proposal for the regulation to prohibit products made using forced labour from being imported into the EU market. So if this is adopted, then that's going to have a big impact on the ability to bring in products if there's forced labour within a supply chain. Something similar in the US with the products being manufactured in the Uyghur region has also been implemented more recently. So it's on that type of model. If we could move on to the next slide, please. Now let's turn to the UK. And so this presently appears that the UK are not going to be following the approach of the EU, at least not at the moment under the current regime. But the EU directives and what's being implemented there are going to have an impact on UK businesses, because if they're going to try to sell into the EU market, they're going to probably need to have a similar type of reporting regime for the companies that they supply to, as well as if they're selling products within the EU market themselves, they're going to have to be following the directives of the EU. The key regulation in the UK market is the Modern Slavery Act 2015, which has already been mentioned, and that requires an annual disclosure of slavery and a modern slavery statement, and it covers a number of companies and ensures that they don't have slavery within their operations, but also within their supply chain. And the reporting requirements require that these companies have an appropriate policy to prevent modern slavery within their supply chain, but as well as they need to collect information, monitor what's going on, and also remediate it. So it's not just the reporting is the sort of legal requirement, but it's everything else that comes underneath that in order to have the appropriate reporting and to know what's going on in your organization, in your supply chain, that also needs to be undertaken. There's also a potential for an unlimited fine and criminal prosecution if there is non-compliance following an injunctive process. There's also been a lot of attention about greenwashing, and regulators have had a particular focus on claims in relation to sustainability that brands have been making. For example, the UK Competition Markets Authority has launched investigations into the eco-friendly statements made by a number of companies, including ASOS, Boohoo, and Asda. And so this is something that, as we've seen from our recent roundtable, that companies are very concerned about what they can and cannot say in relation to their kind of sustainability credentials and their ESG credentials. So companies need to be careful about what they say, but I think it's somehow sort of gone to have a chilling effect, or a green hushing as it's called, on what companies are reporting and what they're saying about the steps they're taking on an ESG front. And it seems as though there's more that's being done than actually is being reported for fear of overstepping the mark. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So the next, I want to talk about litigation risk. And so aside from you've got your regulatory risks of what the regulators are doing, there's a growing risk of litigation as well that's being brought as a result of adverse environmental and human rights impacts within a supply chain. And the Tesco case is a very sort of recent and high profile example of that. And there's been a number of other high profile lawsuits. So for example, there's the lawsuit that occurred after the devastating collapse of the Rana Plaza factory in Bangladesh in 2013. Their survivors and relatives filed a lawsuit in Canada against the companies that were operating the factory, Loblaws and Bureau Veritatis, and that was for the alleged negligence that took place there. Ultimately, that case was dismissed, but it was a significant step for transnational litigation to do with negligence within supply chains, and we'll see what happens with future cases. Other types of complaints within the garment sector have also included actions in India, where some labour unions have filed complaints against H&M for alleged abuses in 2020, as well as Sri Lanka, where there's been complaints that have been submitted against Levi's and Tommy Hilfiger in 2021. Additionally, on the litigation risk side, there is a risk of litigation also in relation to sort of alleged greenwashing claims. So for example, apart from regulators investigating marketing claims, there's a potential for consumers to bring claims against companies if they market something as sustainable when there isn't justification for those claims under the consumer protection laws in the UK, for example. So moving on to the contractual and governance risks. So in addition to those litigation risks, there are your contractual risks that may exist for your organization. It's increasingly common that businesses are including within their supplier contracts provisions that will require due diligence within their supply chain, or certain audit steps, or minimum standards that must be ensured or warranted that they're being met. So both from, as a company with a supply chain, but also a company within a supply chain, so selling on, need to be aware of what those contractual provisions are, and whether more are needed, and to ensure that they're being complied with, because if they're not, that could result in damages or a termination of the contract. On the corporate governance side, you've got an increasing focus on ESG issues at the management and board level, and this has implications for directors' duties. Where a company is going to fall short of the standards that have been set, then they may face shareholders' actions or actions for breaches of directors' duties. And we're seeing companies now adjust some of their constitutions as well, which require directors to consider not just profits, but the interest of all stakeholders. So that may also include workers within a supply chain, as well as the shareholders, as well as the employees of the company. Next slide, please. Specifically in relation to, sorry, actually the slide before, but in relation to directors' duties, they're regulated by the Companies Act 2006, and that requires that the directors understand and anticipate the relevant risks and opportunities that a company faces. So that's going to include ESG risks and risks to your supply chain. So a failure to consider some of these risks when they're going to have a clear impact on the value of the company could result in a breach of the director's duties. And finally, if we can move on to the next slide now, please. Thanks. Just very, very briefly, there's the obvious reputational risk that businesses face if they're implicated in human rights impacts, either directly or within their supply chain. And this can obviously have a very severe impact on a brand and consequential financial losses. There's a recent example of Boohoo, where there was allegations of mistreatment at factories in the UK, and it can sort of a warning of what can happen. In that case, you had a big investor, Aberdeen Standard Investments, sold off 80 million pounds worth of shares in the company. You had a company auditor, PwC, resign. A number of stores stopped selling Boohoo products, and then there was a large-scale social media backlash against the company to boycott the company. So there's very significant consequences for getting this area wrong, both for the brand and for the company. So it's something that needs to be considered in a proactive way. So with that, I'll pass back to Colleen, and happy to have an interesting discussion.
So I'm having a Zoom issue today. Thank you very much, Robert. That was so interesting. Just if I can ask you to pop some questions into the question and answer session. I mean, I have a number of things that really struck me in what has been said by each one of you, and that's this massive change in the landscape for business and how they can navigate their way through it. And we've heard that there are different tools, obviously, to help companies address these issues. So talking about how you might collaborate, how you might understand your compliance requirements and ensure you have effective due diligence. I'm just wondering, are there other things that they should be considering? So, for example, the use of technology, sort of blockchain technology, also, better stakeholder engagement. And I wonder if Amy or any one of you want to just pick up on some of those points. So, what are some of the tools that we have seen that are used effectively to really address some of these challenges and really to overcome them, to help businesses start building these responsible supply chains? I'll ask. Do you want to perhaps start, Amy, and then
yes, yeah,
Robert or Hannah?
Yeah, I've been looking at blockchain in my research actually. It's obviously quite prominent at the moment, quite a lot of focus on it. I mean, excuse me, with anything like blockchain, there's definitely pros and cons. It definitely can be used for sustainability and transparency, but then obviously you've got the argument of the cloud usage, and then it's not actually that good for the environment. But it's, with any kind of solution, there's often pros and cons. So I've been working with a few technology providers, so published a paper fairly recently on this, looking at how it can actually improve the triple bottom line. And we have seen that blockchain can be used for transparency. And it can certainly be make improvements in terms of efficiency. So reducing like duplication of documents. Oh yeah, I did include a slide on blockchain just in case.
Yeah, sorry, just honestly having a bit of a mare with my Zoom today. I'll get to that now for you, Amy. There we go.
Yeah, so we were looking at, definitely it can improve transparency and traceability, because you can actually, you can scan garments and you can see like the whole product journey. You can see, when it left the factory, or even like right from the beginning, when was the cotton, the whole cotton, where did the cotton come from? When was it dyed, for example? When was the fabric dyed? When did the fabric get taken to the factory, and so on? And you can also see who made your garments, and there's that interactive element as well. So the workers can verify their payment, for example, and confirm they've been paid a living wage. And then it's also helpful, we discussed about kind of audit fatigue and trying to reduce some of that documentation that's required. So the blockchain can certainly help with that. And I think that was quite interesting in terms of the value proposition, and the companies that we spoke to that actually are the blockchain technology providers. Originally, they started kind of almost marketing it and working with the brands and trying to get them on board, but they realized actually the factories were the ones that were more willing to come on board, because they could see how it could really benefit them, particularly in terms of efficiency and not reducing the risk of duplication. But I think there's a lot of barriers. I don't think the industry is necessarily ready for it. There's kind of the technology is not there, or there's concern about how to do this, the scalability. I've just come back from Sweden, where we went to visit a fashion brand there, and they've done a pilot, and then they're putting it into more of their lines over the summer, and they really want to kind of roll it out. So I think certain countries are more ahead than necessarily like the UK, for example, and the appetite, and because it will cost the customer more probably as well. And it's also thinking about, will the customer pay for that level of transparency, and kind of they say they want it. And I know when I say to my students, and we look at some of the products and we scan them, and they love scanning it and seeing all the, who made the clothes and the journey, but will actually people pay more for this? I think that's also comes into it as well.
Yeah, Amy, that's so interesting. Hannah or Robert, is there anything you'd like to add around the blockchain technology aspect, or anything you've seen that may be a challenge beyond just the cost piece? Are there other sort of regulatory issues that might be a problem implementing blockchain technology?
I've got, I guess, a couple of maybe observations and maybe a question also for Amy. I mean, we've actually working here with a tech company as well, who is using QR codes to sort of track it in a similar way, or to put onto garments. And I mean, one of the things that I was thinking is whether where the push should come from, whether it is the consumers or whether it is the regulators. And so, for example, just as an example, the EU a requirement, or in a particular country, that anyone selling in that country has to have that type of technology, whether that's too sort of heavy-handed and top-down approach, or whether something from a consumer-led bottom-up approach is sort of the better way to go. So sort of probably more of a question for Amy. And then just the other observation is that I think that type of technology is very useful. Now, coming from with my litigator's hat on, is on the basis of, if there are certain claims that are being made about sustainability, then the company has this evidence and this ability to track every basis that it's using to make that claim, and that it can then refer to that, whether it's being questioned about, well, how can you say this? That is, I think, a really important piece, which I can see a huge need for, and that from the cost piece, it's also a sort of a risk management piece from the companies. So yes, it may be a greater cost, but it's sort of worth it from the risk management perspective. But pass back maybe to Amy to respond.
Thank you, Robert. Amy.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. Some really good points, Robert. And I've not kind of delved into kind of looking at the customer side too. I think that'd be really interesting research to see kind of whether it could come from bottom up. I think there's often like that attitude behavior gap where customers will say they want this, like I said, but may not necessarily want to pay the higher price for like blockchain enabled garments. Because I've focused on kind of from the business side, looking at the technology company, the factory and the brand. I think the most interesting thing coming out was like the factory being the ones that were really keen to drive it. But I think we need like everyone involved. Like I missed a point that like even like auditors and certifiers, like everyone needs to be linked. And then it links to your point, Robert, about having that level of transparency that if there is an issue, you can link everyone together and show actually what's been happening throughout your supply chain.
I do think that underpinning of your due diligence framework is just so key, isn't it? That demonstration, of what you're actually doing and how you are able to then mitigate your risk. I can see, how much of an advantage it'd be if you are able to track things, and then I guess within that as well, ensure that your contractual provisions are also, kind of being used to secure your responsible supply chain. I mean, I don't know if you want to mention that, something about that, Robert. I see there's a question that's come through, but if there's just, something around responsible contractual provisions and how that might also link into the use of blockchain and demonstrating that effective due diligence that's taking place.
Yeah, certainly. And one of the, I guess, the key tools that businesses have in trying to manage responsible supply chain is obviously the contracts that they enter into when they're purchasing from factories, and that sort of goes all the way down the supply chain, whether it's first tier, second tier. They can set up a contractual framework that will be able to kind of govern that relationship. And so when doing that, companies need to think about what are the minimum standards that they want to have within that contractual framework to ensure that the minimum standards are kept within the certain factories and from the companies that they're purchasing from. So that will depend on where they're operating, who their suppliers are. But one of the things that they can do is potentially make use of that blockchain type technology and require all of their suppliers to, whether it is a particular system, to follow that approach and to ensure that every garment that they purchase has to be QR coded and recorded. So that's one sort of way they could do it through contractual mechanisms. And then also when setting up that framework, need to consider how to deal with issues that may arise. So if things don't meet the standards that are required, then thinking about what is the appropriate remedy for the organization, but also to help trying to address the issues that are uncovered. And so what we're seeing, I think, more recently is rather than terminating the contract, which was kind of, I think, the traditional approach, is if you have something that falls short of the requirements within the contract and some issues in regards to human rights, then to terminate that supplier. But what we're seeing is businesses actually taking a more proactive approach and trying to address the issues once they've uncovered it, being transparent about it, trying to address the underlying causes of why there is that human rights impact, and then working with their suppliers to develop solutions, whether that's they find child labour potentially, whether that's then to provide support for schools within the area so that they don't need child labour. So those sorts of things that wouldn't really necessarily fit within the contractual framework, but it's for practical solutions as well.
Yeah, thank you, Robert. And Hannah, do come in if you'd like to add something. I mean, we have had a question, and I think in a way, Robert, you might already have addressed some of this about, you know, the feasibility of a retailer ensuring compliance amongst its supply chain. I mean, and I don't know about you, but we have this question quite a lot working with organizations. It's just how far you go and how do you ensure some of that compliance. And certainly, you know, in asking for some kind of contractual protection is probably a bottom line, looking at the supplier code of conduct. I did want to actually come in just on the point about if things go wrong. I think what we haven't had a chance to talk about today is stakeholder engagement. And that, of course, is also going to lead to, you know, what leverage you have over suppliers and what you're going to ask them to do. So I won't directly answer that question at the moment. I just wonder if either Amy, Robert, or Hannah, you want to add something to it about, I think essentially it's asking, you know, to what extent you are going to require suppliers to comply with trafficking laws or other things. I mean, I'll ask you to comment on that, or perhaps add anything else.
I think essentially the bigger thing to look at here is, do you have an effective due diligence process in place? And are you comfortable with that internally and comfortable with how far you're going before you start asking what should we expect of suppliers? Because I think it'll answer your question in turn. So I think, you know, and I think also with the challenges when we were discussing them in the roundtable, there is also a point around solutions about maybe cutting your supplier lists down or starting to localize production as solutions to some of these challenges, which in turn will probably help with your supplier expectations, because you'll have greater levels of familiarity with your suppliers and you'll probably feel more comfortable in who you are obtaining products from.
Thank you, Hannah. That's useful. Robert or Amy, would you like to add anything to the question that was raised? I think there's also a question of oversight in there, which is a very broad question. I'm not sure, Robert, you can answer that in 1 minute, but Amy or Robert, do you want to add anything to the question that was raised about keeping or ensuring that suppliers will comply with certain laws and requirements?
Amy, happy to to address it, which I have sort of partly with the contractual framework. There's a couple of things. There's an organizational piece, so working out within your organization where you're operating, where your supply chain are. So you've got your operational level people that need to know, okay, what's happening within that supply chain and whether that requires us to do a certain level of due diligence, get independent auditors. So that's one aspect. Then I guess you've got the other aspect of the board and the management level. Are they setting up the right policies, the right culture, the right due diligence in place that they can then kind of look to? And I think this goes to your oversight point. If you miss something, are you going to be held liable? And I guess it will depend on how reasonable the steps that you've been taking are, both from a due diligence perspective, the policies that you've established, the mechanisms within your organization to have oversight of the operations, and then how that's being implemented. So if there is a track record that you have set up the policies, you have set up an operations team that knows where their supply chains, where they're who's in their supply chain, they've got a due diligence framework, they've got an audit framework. Then if there are issues that do arise, which it happens, and we've seen it, I think we're all we're not naive that human rights impacts do occur, but then it's how you deal with them. And so it's being transparent about it, open about it, acknowledging it, remediating it. Then that reduces your risk of being liable at sort of the company level if you've got all of those steps in place. The reverse is if you don't and you turn a blind eye, you try to cover it up, then yes, that's where the liability generally we see kicks in. Hope that answers it.
I wonder, that's so helpful. I mean, I wonder if part of also that sort of an additional piece in here is also the prioritizing of where you address your risk. So it is very much an approach of the UNGPs that you don't have to do everything everywhere. We know that's impossible for many huge clients who've got thousands of suppliers. but the organizational piece is exactly as you say, knowing where that supply chain is, prioritizing your risks, and then addressing the high risks so that you again have a systematic approach to how you are dealing with this, again, to be able to mitigate your risk if something does go wrong. Amy, did you want to add anything to this? I know quite technical, kind of slightly legally pieces, but I'm sure you might have something to add.
No, just, yeah, I think I agree with the points. I mean, I think Robert obviously is better at doing the whole legal side, but yeah, I think it is difficult because supply chains are so big that you can't possibly like understand every element, but that's probably where the collaboration piece comes through. And because they're so overlapping and you can start to share expertise and resources, that's how you could actually start tackling it a lot better as well.
That's great. And I'm just wondering if there's any sort of wrap-up points that we've got a few minutes left. I'm not sure it allows for another question, but kind of, you know, any wrap-up observations from what we've been discussing today. You know, certainly for me, it's been really interesting to get that full oversight of some of the challenges. I think at the roundtable also, you know, what are some of the barriers that are facing companies? We haven't had a chance to talk about all of them, you know, resources being a particular issue, perhaps capacity building being something else. But Robert, Amy, Hannah, anything you'd just like to add before I wrap up today?
I think on cost, there's, you know, it is unfortunately going to cost to make your supply chains more sustainable, and that cost is inevitably going to be passed down to consumers. And I think there's just a big piece there to ensure that you're communicating why there is this greater cost so that people do continue to buy into products, and also responsibility on companies to change the mindset of consumers and go away from this disposable fashion that I think people have become stuck in, and start to create pieces that they can rewear and want to rewear and restyle.
That's great. Thank you, Hannah. Amy or Robert, do you want to add to this?
The only sort of addition I would have, which is not legal at all, but it's the cultural piece. I think it's and that's what we're sort of seeing with clients. It's creating a culture both within the organization and in your supply chain that doesn't accept human rights impacts, that doesn't accept abuses, doesn't accept child labor. So it's that cultural piece, which is kind of a top down, but it's throughout the organization, which I think is something that's is really important, and it goes with that collaboration that Amy was talking about.
Completely. Thank you, Robert. Amy, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think both of those are really good angles, but probably repeating it, but there's definitely the cultural piece and there's the educational piece, and without that, yeah, change isn't really going to happen. So, but then I think it does seem like really complex and overwhelming, but everyone has to start somewhere to really make that difference.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And you know, I have seen, and I'm sure you have, is that the laws are pushing us in a certain direction, but certainly as businesses become more aware of both the risks and actually perhaps the opportunities in this as well, that's where you start seeing that shift, and something that I'm sure for many people possibly even listening today, it's also emphasizing how much of a journey this is, that there really is, it does take time to understand, you know, things from a human rights lens, and it does require a shift in a mindset, which also takes time. And actually the last thing I'd almost say about that is although we know that there's a time and a journey, I think that the fact that there are now requirements by the law that's being set, maybe that's going to accelerate things as well, because you can't just ignore the compliance aspect, even if you want to ignore some of the other aspects. Anyway, thank you so much. We've reached the end of our hour. We've so I've so enjoyed. I've heard Amy and Robert, of course, they participated with us as collaborators on Roundtable before, and just listening again to, you know, both of their presentations and their real expertise around this has been an absolute pleasure. And thank you to Hannah, who's also played a role in helping coordinate and push some of the